Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to Stranger Things and representation. This video is going to be particularly relevant for you if you are studying OCR A-level media studies, as Stranger Things is one of the current set TV dramas that you might study on this specification. So we're going to start by having a look at the representation of women within Stranger Things. Have a look at characters like Joyce. She's a very caring, protective mother who is desperately searching for her son. This idea that she's very maternal and is always trying to save his life and never gives up. There's that kind of quite typical representation of a woman being quite maternal and protective of her children. But, it also is combined with this kind of unconventional representation of being quite strong and, not giving up in the face of a lot of people who decide they don't believe her. So there's a kind of mix of representations within Joyce as a character. At some point, she's represented as quite mentally unstable, so she's seen sort of on the floor and wrapped in fairy lights, and there's an implication from some of the other characters that she might be losing it at some points. So perhaps representing women as quite emotional and sort of unable to control their mental health and their thoughts, that's a reasonably typical representation of women. There's some other quite stereotypical representations of women within the show as well. So have a look at people like Florence, who is the police secretary. She clearly feels quite frustrated. She's constantly trying to pass on messages and tell the police what's happening and what they need to do. And they do not listen to her at all. So this idea that she's a secretary rather than a policeman herself, and she's not being listened to, not being respected. Mrs. Wheeler is portrayed as the more stereotypical housewife, staying at home, looking after her family, cooking for them, making them dinner. She's shown as being quite annoyed with her husband, who is kind of disrespecting her or not listening to her as well. 11 has some stereotypical representations. She's young, she's victimised, she's held captive, she's tortured. This idea of a female victim or a damsel in distress, that's quite a conventional representation of women too. Nancy kind of plays this typical kind of princess character within the narrative. So she's quite stereotypically beautiful, she's desired by some of the other characters, and she refuses to have sex, she wants to stay a virgin. And this idea of girls' virginity being important, the idea of prizing innocence within girls, again is quite a stereotypical representation of young girls within the media. However, there are some aspects of women that challenge representations and stereotypes. So like I said, Joyce is quite powerful. She's quite aggressive. She doesn't stop when people don't believe her. She keeps on and on and on until someone does something. Nancy is a science genius. She works very hard and she's very clever at school. And often girls are represented as not being very intelligent and not being involved in things like technology, engineering, or science. 11 is obviously super powerful with supernatural powers. She can control, dominate, and even kill people. So clearly challenging the representations of women here. She has a shaved head, which is quite unusual for a female character. It means that at some point she's actually mistaken for a boy by some of the other characters. So it's this idea perhaps that she's taking on a more masculine look, and that perhaps explains her more masculine representation. Because she's grown up in this kind of kidnapped culture where she hasn't been exposed to the outside world at all, she hasn't necessarily learned any of those typical gender roles or gender performances. She doesn't know anything about wearing dresses or pink or painting your nails and putting makeup on. So she doesn't understand any of those gender stereotypes, and that is potentially why she acts the way she does. At some point in the show, they actually dress her up to make her seem like more of a normal female. So there are some ideas within the show that there are some ways in which you should behave to be more typically or normally mainstream feminine. So the representations of women are quite mixed within the show. Let's have a look at the representation of men next. You have Hopper, who's kind of the chief of police, obviously a position of power and status. You see him drinking beer and being quite lazy, being quite disrespectful and not listening to his staff. It's quite a stereotypical representation of men when he doesn't believe Joyce several times. This idea that he's not listening to women that he meets. You have other men in positions of power as well. So, for example, the other police officers. You also have Principal Coleman and Dr. Brennan as well. So men really being shown in positions of high status in this community. This perhaps represents the cultural and historical context of 1980s small town America, where men were predominantly given those more high status roles within society. Men are often seen as being quite bad, quite antagonistic as well. So you have the kind of evil corporation at HAWKINS power, the kind of faceless men in suits who are torturing 11. So men in positions of being quite bad, quite evil, quite nasty, distrustful, violent and aggressive. Men are also seen as absent fathers. So there are several elements within the show that refer to men as not being at home with their children, whether it is people who've been divorced or people who've died or people who've moved away. But it's this idea that men don't necessarily have a huge connection with their children. And that's a very stereotypical representation of men within family life. The boys are obviously men too, so we have to consider them as the main protagonists in the show. There are some stereotypical representations here, so perhaps being seen as quite immature, silly, playing games, lots of banter, lots of fun. So reasonably stereotypical representation of young men, young boys. But also they are quite emotional. So, you know, there are images of them crying, getting upset, worrying about Will, wanting to protect him, wanting to save him. Representations of them being quite protective and caring. And actually later on in the episode and the series, we see Hopper become a lot more caring as well, and emotional too. So perhaps some representations of men and boys do challenge typical ideas about gender and masculinity. If you take a look at the scientist at the very beginning of the episode, you can see he looks really scared. He's visibly shaking, constantly looking behind him, and he's very, very urgently trying to get into the elevator. And this is quite an unconventional representation of men. Men are often shown to be quite brave and strong in the face of danger in media products, whereas this is very much representing him as being quite scared and weak. Perhaps he's represented in this way to really make it clear to the audience that whatever it is that is coming down that corridor is incredibly scary. The cast is quite diverse in terms of ethnicity. So you have several black characters within the show as well as white characters. 1980s small town America was often, very white dominated. Lucas is one of the main characters, one of the boys in the group of friends. He is seen really integrated into their community, obviously part of a very tight friendship group. They get along really well. They play the same games, they like the same foods, they wear the same Halloween costumes. So there's this real idea of ethnic integration within that friendship group. So perhaps this is reflective of the fact that even though it's set in the 80s, it's made in a more modern context. So it's reflecting a more modern attitude towards race. It certainly seems to be the white male characters portrayed as the faces of evil and violence and kidnap and conspiracy theories. So perhaps challenging some representations of ethnicity here, where the black characters like Lucas are seen as positive and happy protagonists, and the white male characters are often seen as in more antagonistic roles. There are lots of ideas of young people not being listened to by adults, children trying to get adults to understand what they're saying and to believe them, and adults failing to listen. And that's quite a typical representation of children and adults. The children are very much the protagonists here. They are heroic. They defy the adults and go out to save their friend themselves. So that's quite challenging and alternative in terms of age stereotypes. Children are often seen as weak or submissive or less capable, vulnerable and needing protecting. And actually, it's the children that get things done in this show. Dustin, as a character, does have a medical condition, a disability, and disability within TV drama is often not covered or represented at all. So the inclusion of a character that has this is quite unconventional and perhaps represents the show and the producers as being quite inclusive. Within his friendship group, they're very accepting and welcoming, so showing them as being quite liberal and open-minded too. However, he's clearly the comic character, the kind of joker, the one we're supposed to laugh at. So, sometimes when there are people with issues like disabilities, they do become kind of the joker character, and that's perhaps typically more conventional. So the representations of things like age, gender and ethnicity are quite diverse and quite complex. Some stereotypes and definitely quite a lot of challenging of stereotypes. You should also be aware about the representation of reality and how they construct that within the show. There's obviously lots of details from the 80s. So like I said, intertextual references to the 80s. There's lots of settings, lots of costumes, lots of music that helps to set the scene as 1980s small town America. You know, even things like the style of the Coke cans and the Burger King logos have been almost retrified to make it feel like it really is the 80s. This creates a lot of realism for the audiences, and the reason that's important is because there's obviously a lot of surreal fantasy style sci-fi iconography as well, so things like monsters and gore, special effects. And I suppose the idea is that if you have to have some sci-fi elements that are more fantastical, if you root it in reality it becomes more believable. So the realism style elements, the verisimilitude that they create with all those small details about the 80s and about small town America, it helps to make the monsters more believable. A lot of audiences will take the preferred reading of this show. They might enjoy the nostalgic representations. But there are some audiences who may take a more negotiated or oppositional reading. They may be frustrated with some of the representations. They may see Nancy as quite a kind of misogynistic portrayal of a kind of typical princess style character. They may be frustrated by the fact that Lucas is one of the only ethnic minority, people within the main cast. So some people might be frustrated by the fact that there's not more diversity. They might be frustrated by some sexist elements, the fact that, the women are often housewives and mothers. Some audiences may take that oppositional reading. So that is my easy to understand guide to Stranger Things and representation. Don't forget to check out my channel for lots of other videos that might be useful for you. If there is a video that you would like that I don't already have, please leave a little comment below and I will see what I can do.